My uncle secretly slipped something into my grandma's drink at her own 85th birthday party in front of everyone, and when she collapsed, he actually smiled, but the security camera caught his every move and destroyed him completely. I saw my uncle smile when my grandmother collapsed. That is the sentence I have to open with, because everything that followed, every moment that shattered our family in the months after that birthday party, traces back to that smile. Not a nervous smile. Not the smile of someone startled or frightened or uncertain what to do. A real smile, brief and controlled, the kind that arrives before a person remembers to arrange their face into something appropriate. My grandmother was on the floor of her own dining room, her 85th birthday cake still uncut on the table behind her, and my Uncle Richard stood 3 feet away and smiled. I saw it. And in that moment, something I had been telling myself was paranoia for 2 years became the clearest truth I had ever witnessed. My name is Maya. I am 29 years old. My grandmother, Eleanor, is the kind of woman that holds a family together simply by existing. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But in the way that certain people become the center of gravity for everyone around them, the person everyone orients toward without being asked to. She raised 4 children largely on her own after my grandfather passed when she was 42. She built a small but stable life through decades of careful decisions. And at 85 she was sharp, present, and in possession of a house and savings that represented everything she had built across a lifetime of discipline. My Uncle Richard is her youngest son. He is 58 years old and has spent most of those years in the specific condition of a man who believes he deserves more than he has managed to accumulate. He has a charm that works on people who do not know him well and a resentment that becomes visible to people who do. He had been living with my grandmother for 2 years before the party, a temporary arrangement that had become permanent in the way that temporary arrangements do when the person benefiting from them has no motivation to change them. He managed her appointments, he told people. He helped around the house. What he actually did was position himself as indispensable while systematically working to become the primary person in her life. I had watched it happen. I want to be clear that I had watched it and said things and been told I was imagining it. My mother, Richard's older sister, had listened to my concerns twice and told me that Richard was difficult but not dangerous, that Grandma Eleanor was not someone who could be manipulated, that I was being uncharitable. I had cousins who agreed with me and cousins who thought I was causing unnecessary family tension. And I had my grandmother herself, who loved Richard the way mothers love their most complicated children, with a patience and a blindness that coexisted in ways I could not fully understand. The birthday party was my mother's idea. 85 was a milestone and Eleanor deserved a celebration, a real one, with family and close friends and the chocolate cake she had loved her entire life. There were 32 people in that house on a Saturday afternoon in April. My mother and aunts had spent 2 days preparing. The house was decorated. There were photographs on display spanning decades. There was laughter and noise and the particular warmth of a gathering built around someone everyone genuinely loved. Richard had offered to manage the drinks. That was the word he used. Manage. He had set up a small table near the kitchen with pitchers of lemonade and iced tea and sparkling water, and he moved through the party with a host's energy that I had noticed but not yet understood. He was more present than usual. More attentive. He refilled glasses. He directed people toward the food table. He was performing a version of himself that was more generous and engaged than the version I had observed for 2 years, and I watched it with the unease of someone who recognizes a performance without yet knowing what it is in service of. My grandmother's glass was specific. She had a particular glass she used at home, a tall one with a blue rim that had belonged to her mother, and someone, I did not see who initially, had placed it on the drinks table filled with what appeared to be her usual lemonade. I saw Richard near that glass twice before my grandmother picked it up. The first time I thought nothing of it. The second time something shifted in my attention, some instinct that I did not have language for yet, and I watched him move away from the table with the specific casualness of someone trying to appear casual. My grandmother picked up her glass 40 minutes into the party. She drank from it while talking to her oldest friend, a woman named Dorothy who had known her for 60 years. She drank perhaps half of it over the course of 20 minutes. And then, in the middle of a sentence, she stopped. Dorothy told me later that Eleanor's expression changed before anything physical happened. That she looked confused in a way Dorothy had never seen on her face before. And then her legs went and she went down and the room went from celebration to chaos in the space of 4 seconds. I was across the room. I moved toward her immediately. And as I moved I passed Richard, and I saw his face in the 2 seconds before he understood that people were looking, and what I saw on his face was not horror. It was not panic. It was a brief and private satisfaction that disappeared the moment he registered that the room had witnessed the collapse and that he needed to become a concerned brother immediately. Someone called emergency services. Someone else helped Eleanor to a stable position on the floor. I knelt beside her and held her hand and told her she was going to be okay while internally I was replaying the smile, trying to understand what I had seen, trying to decide if I had seen what I thought I had seen or if grief and suspicion had finally distorted my perception completely. The emergency responders arrived in 8 minutes. They were thorough and calm, and they asked questions about what Eleanor had eaten and drunk. I answered what I could. My mother answered what she could. Richard answered with the specific helpfulness of someone who wants to be seen as cooperative, and I watched him answer, and I thought about the glass with the blue rim, and I made a decision. I went to the drinks table while the responders were with Eleanor and everyone else was focused on her. The glass with the blue rim was still there, half full. I found an empty container in the kitchen, a small jar with a lid, and I transferred what remained in the glass into it. I do not know exactly why I did this. Some combination of instinct and the memory of that smile and 2 years of watching Richard position himself in ways that had made me uneasy. I put the jar in my bag. I said nothing to anyone. Eleanor was taken to the hospital. The party ended the way celebrations end when something goes wrong in the middle of them, abruptly and with a stunned silence that lingers after everyone has left. I drove to the hospital with my mother and we sat in a waiting room, and my mother cried quietly and I held her hand and thought about what I had in my bag and what I was going to do with it. The doctors stabilized Eleanor within hours. They told us she had experienced a significant episode that appeared consistent with ingesting a substance that had interacted severely with her existing medications. They asked if she had taken anything unusual. They asked about her drinks. They were careful with their language in the way that medical professionals are careful when they suspect something but cannot yet confirm it. I told the attending doctor privately that I had a sample of what my grandmother had been drinking. He looked at me for a moment and then he asked me to please not discard it and to make it available if requested. I said I would. I drove home that night with the jar in my bag and Richard's smile behind my eyes and the understanding that whatever came next was going to require me to be very careful and very certain before I said anything to anyone. I contacted a private testing service the following morning. The kind that handles samples for legal purposes. They were professional and specific about what they needed and what they could determine and how long it would take. I submitted the sample. I paid the fee. I waited. The results came back in 9 days. The sample contained a substance, a specific compound that in the quantities present would produce exactly the symptoms my grandmother had experienced, and which would interact with her existing medications in precisely the way the doctors had described. It was not a natural contaminant. It was not a medication error. It was something that had been deliberately introduced into the liquid. I sat with that report for 2 hours before I did anything else. I read it 3 times. I thought about my grandmother on the floor of her own dining room on her 85th birthday. I thought about Richard's smile. I thought about 2 years of watching and being told I was imagining things. And then I remembered something. The house had a security camera system that my cousin James had installed 18 months ago after a neighborhood incident. Interior cameras in the main living areas, including the area near the kitchen where the drinks table had been set up. I called James. I asked him if the cameras had been recording on the day of the party. He said yes. I asked if he could pull the footage from that afternoon. He asked why. I told him I needed to see something. He was quiet for a moment and then he said he would send me access. I watched the footage alone in my apartment that evening. I watched the party from the angle of a camera that had recorded everything without anyone thinking about it. I watched Richard at the drinks table. I watched him clearly, unambiguously, in footage that was time-stamped and continuous, do something to my grandmother's glass that he had no reason to do and no explanation for. I watched him look around before he did it. I watched him move away afterward. I watched my grandmother pick up the glass 40 minutes later. And I watched his face when she collapsed. The camera angle was different from where I had been standing in the room. It was closer. It was clearer. And what it captured on Richard's face in the 2 seconds before he composed himself was something that no one who watched that footage would be able to interpret as anything other than what it was. I called my mother that night. I told her I needed her to come over. I told her I had something she needed to see. She heard something in my voice and she came within the hour, and I showed her the footage and I showed her the test results, and I sat beside her while she watched and read, and I watched her face change in the specific way that a person's face changes when something they refuse to believe becomes impossible to refuse any longer. She was silent for a long time after. And then she said, very quietly, that she needed to call her sister. And that they needed to call the police. The police came the following morning. Not because my mother called them that night, though she did, but because the hospital had also flagged Eleanor's case for review after their own testing had returned results consistent with deliberate interference. 2 separate processes had arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously, and when my mother called to report what we had found, she learned that an investigation had already quietly begun. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Reyes, who had the specific manner of someone who has seen many things and allows very few of them to show on her face. She came to my apartment first. I gave her the test results, the original sample still in the jar, and access to the security footage. She reviewed everything with a thoroughness that was reassuring in its patience. She asked precise questions. She wrote things down. She thanked me for preserving the sample and told me, carefully, that what I had done had been important. She did not tell me what was going to happen next. She did not need to. I had seen the footage. I had the results. I understood that what existed in that evidence was not ambiguous. Richard was at my grandmother's house when the police arrived to speak with him. He had been there every day since the party, performing concern with the same energy he had performed helpfulness at the celebration, visiting Eleanor at the hospital, managing her care in ways that positioned him as devoted. He had told family members that he was devastated, that he could not understand what had happened, that he was terrified for his mother. My cousin James, who had given me access to the footage and had watched it himself by that point, told me later what happened when Detective Reyes arrived at the house. That Richard opened the door with the expression of a concerned son expecting an update on his mother's condition. That the expression changed when he saw that the detective was not alone. That he invited them in with a calmness that lasted approximately 4 minutes before the questions became specific enough that the calmness was no longer available to him. He was taken in for questioning that afternoon. Not arrested. Not yet. But the questions had become specific enough that his attorney, whom he called within 20 minutes of the detective's arrival, advised him not to answer further without legal representation present. The family found out in pieces over the following 48 hours. Some from my mother. Some from the cousins who had been talking to each other. Some from Richard himself, who called several family members with a version of events that positioned him as the subject of a misunderstanding driven by my long-standing dislike of him. He was specific about that last part. He named me. He told people I had always had it out for him and that I had manipulated evidence and manufactured a story to destroy him. I had expected this. I want to be honest about that because I think it is important. I had known from the moment I preserved that sample that the version of events Richard would offer would center my malice rather than his actions. It is what people do when the truth is unavailable to them. They redirect toward the person who found it. Some family members believed him initially. Not because they were foolish but because the alternative required them to believe something about a person they had known for decades that was genuinely difficult to absorb. My Aunt Patricia, Richard's closest sibling in age, called me 3 days after the police visit and told me she thought I was making a terrible mistake. That Richard would never. That I had always been difficult about him and this was the result of years of accumulated resentment finding an outlet. I listened to her. I told her I understood why she felt that way. I told her the footage existed and the test results existed and that I had not created either of them. She called me again 2 weeks later. The call was shorter. She did not say she was sorry exactly. She said she had seen the footage that James had shared with the family. She said she needed time. I told her I understood. Eleanor came home from the hospital after 11 days. She was weakened but recovering, and her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her trajectory. She came home to a house that no longer had Richard in it, which was the result of a family decision made while she was still hospitalized, a quiet and unanimous agreement that his presence in her home was no longer something anyone was willing to accommodate regardless of what the legal process ultimately determined. I visited her the second day she was home. She was in her chair by the window, the one she had always preferred, with a blanket across her lap and more clarity in her eyes than I had been afraid to hope for given everything she had been through. She looked at me when I came in and she said my name in a way that had something specific in it. Something that was not just greeting but acknowledgement. I sat with her for 2 hours. We did not talk about Richard for most of it. We talked about other things, her garden, a book she had been reading before the party, a memory she had of my grandfather that she had not shared with me before. And then, near the end of my visit, she took my hand and she said she knew what I had done. That someone had told her about the sample and the footage. That she understood what finding those things had required of me and what preserving them had cost me in terms of family peace. She said, very quietly, that she was grateful. And that she was sorry it had taken something this serious for people to understand what she now understood she had been too willing to overlook. I told her she did not need to apologize. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has decided to be honest regardless of whether honesty is comfortable. She said, I saw things over the past 2 years that I explained away because explaining away was easier than the alternative. You tried to tell me. I did not listen the way I should have. She squeezed my hand. I am listening now. Richard was formally charged 4 weeks after the party. The charges were serious, the kind that carry significant potential consequences, built on the foundation of the test results, the security footage, and additional evidence that Detective Reyes' investigation had uncovered in the weeks following his questioning. Financial records. Communications. A pattern of behavior that the footage had opened the door to examining more closely. His attorney mounted a defense. This is what attorneys do and it is what the process requires, and I understood that. The defense attempted several angles: contamination of the sample, misinterpretation of the footage, the argument that what was visible on camera was ambiguous and subject to interpretation. Each angle encountered the specific problem that the evidence had been carefully preserved and the footage was not ambiguous to anyone who watched it without already having decided what they needed it to mean. The legal process took 8 months. I will not detail every step because the steps themselves are less important than what they revealed. What they revealed, in the course of the investigation, was that Richard had been managing my grandmother's finances in ways that had not been disclosed to the family. That he had positioned himself over 2 years to become the primary beneficiary of her estate. That the substance introduced into her drink would not, in the quantities present, have been fatal to a healthy person but would, given Eleanor's age and medications, have created serious and potentially permanent medical complications that would have required a level of care that would have benefited from someone being legally positioned to manage her affairs. He had not been trying to end her life. He had been trying to ensure she needed him completely. The distinction is one I have spent considerable time sitting with because it changes the shape of what he did without diminishing it. He accepted a plea agreement in month 8. The terms involved a conviction, a period of incarceration, and conditions related to his contact with Eleanor and management of her affairs that were comprehensive and permanent. His attorney released a statement that contained language about remorse. Richard himself said nothing publicly. The family reconfigured in the aftermath the way families do when something foundational has been damaged, unevenly, imperfectly, with some relationships strengthened and some permanently altered and some simply gone. My Aunt Patricia and I reached a place that I would describe as honest and careful. She had watched the footage. She had read the reports. She had done the work of understanding what she had dismissed and what that dismissal had cost, and she had done it without asking me to make it easier for her. I respected that. Other relationships did not survive. A cousin who had been close to Richard chose to maintain that closeness in ways that made continued connection with me impossible. I made peace with that. Not quickly, but genuinely. My grandmother's house was reorganized. Legally and practically. A proper care arrangement was established with professional involvement and family oversight that did not rely on any single person's unchecked access. Eleanor had her affairs reviewed thoroughly by an independent attorney and made decisions about her estate with full information and without any person positioned to benefit from influencing those decisions. She is doing well. I visit every week. We sit in her living room and we talk about her garden and books and my grandfather, and sometimes we talk about what happened, carefully and honestly, in the way that people talk about things that change them permanently but do not define them completely. She told me once, several months after everything had resolved, that she thought about the moment she picked up her glass at the party. That she remembered tasting something slightly different and telling herself it was her imagination. That she had trained herself across 85 years to not make a fuss about small things, to not cause problems, to assume the best of the people she loved. She said she was working on unlearning some of that. I kept the test report. Not because I need it anymore but because it represents something I want to remember about what it cost to trust what I had seen when everyone around me was comfortable not seeing it. I had watched Richard for 2 years with an unease I could not fully name and been told I was creating problems. I had preserved a sample on instinct and been told I was manufacturing a crisis. And what I had actually been doing, in both cases, was paying attention in a room full of people who had decided that paying attention was too uncomfortable. The security camera caught everything. Not because anyone had installed it with this in mind. Because James had done a practical thing 18 months earlier for a practical reason and the footage had existed, waiting, recording everything in that dining room, including a smile that lasted 2 seconds before a man remembered to arrange his face into something that looked like love. My grandmother turned 86 last month. We had a small celebration. Family only. No drinks table managed by anyone other than the people who made the food. My grandmother sat in the center of it in the specific way she always has, the gravitational center that everyone orients toward without being asked to, and she blew out her candles and she laughed at something my mother said and she looked, in that moment, exactly like herself. Some people spend years positioning themselves to take from the people who love them most, calculating and patient and certain they have accounted for every variable. They do not account for the person in the corner who has been watching. Who trusts what they see even when everyone tells them they are wrong? Who preserves a sample on instinct and pulls footage on a hunch and sits alone with the truth long enough to understand what it requires of them? They do not account for the camera that has been running the whole time. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who loves you is assume their love makes them blind. Because sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who have been watching you most carefully. And sometimes the evidence they have been quietly collecting is already more than enough.